and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 352, interview with Ray Boomhower about his book, Richard Tregaskis, Reporting Under Fire from Guadalcanal to Vietnam. Ray Boomhower is a biographer and former reporter who has written about Ernie Pyle, Robert Sherrod, Gus Grissom, and others who have stood out or contributed to the story that is World War II. Today we will discuss the incredible life of Richard Tregaskis and his contribution to the telling of the GI story. Ray, which sounds very weird to say, thank you very much for being with us today.
Ray, glad to be here with you.
First of all, I love your name. I've never spoken to another Ray on this show, so I think that's great. But I will call you Mr. Boomhower because, one, I don't want to confuse myself, and two, my grandfather would insist that I use your last name. So,
a fine old gentleman,
yeah,
then. Yes.
Exactly. I'm very excited to have you on because when I first came across the story of Richard, and I read your book several times, including the audiobook, I enjoyed that very much. I was very excited to get you on because this is a story about a man who has a lot of bravery, and yet he does not fight. He's courageous, as in he returns back to the front after being very seriously injured when he did not have to. He's in the middle of a lot of fighting. He sees a lot of things, and the only thing that he's armed with is a typewriter. Could you please introduce us to Richard Tregaskis, please?
My book is Richard Tregaskis, Reporting Under Fire from Guadalcanal to Vietnam. And in it, I take a concentrated look at his extensive experience in reporting on combat operations, both in World War II and in Vietnam. And what attracted me to him from the first was the wide range of his experiences during World War II, right, from the Pacific to Europe and then back to the Pacific. I had done a couple of other books on war correspondence. I went to school at Indiana University in Bloomington and majored in journalism. Mm-hmm. And, of course, I went to journalism classes at a building named after Ernie Pyle, the famous reporter who attended IU, went on to write so well about the war and lost his life in doing so. Right. And that whetted my appetite for doing other books on war correspondence. And my second one was on Robert Sherrod, who was kind of the Ernie Pyle of the Marine Corps in the Pacific. He followed the Marines in their drive across the Central Pacific from Tarawa to Saipan, Okinawa. Right. And so I thought, well, why not do a war correspondent trilogy? And I was looking around for people to write about. Right. And I hit upon, of course, Richard Tregaskis. I had read his book, his best-selling and classic war book, The Guadalcanal Diary, in high school, and that impressed me very highly. And I really hit upon him as a subject when I realized that both of us share a birthday. We were both born on November 28th, so it seemed almost destiny that I would write about what one of his colleagues called the bravest of the brave war correspondents of World War II. Wow. So that set me on a 3-year journey to research his life and to write about his fascinating and incredible experiences writing from the Pacific and Europe in World War II.
Right. I know, and I'm certainly glad you did because I enjoyed his story so much. So let's just jump into this. So as we all are, Richard, to a degree, is a product of his environment. Could you introduce us to his parents and his early life? He certainly had very loving and supporting parents who wanted to broaden his horizon as much as possible.
He did. He was born on November 28, 1916. He was the second child and first son of his parents, Archibald and Maud Osterman Tregaskis. Grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and one of the main employers in that town at the time was the Senior Sewing Company. And his father worked in the editorial department at Singer and prospered. His mother made sure to take advantage of the nearby cultural attractions of New York City. Of course, Elizabeth is just a stone's throw from that major city. So he took she took Richard and his sister, Madeline, on many trips to museums and other spots in New York City.
Right.
And they were able to afford to rent a summer cottage. So he learned how to swim from an early age, and it's an avocation that he kept for the rest of his life. Right. And was always a very good swimmer. So he had a lot of cultural advantages, went to a couple of private schools early on, but of course the ravages of the Great Depression soon put a financial strain on the family.
Right.
And Dick was very good about supporting himself and getting a good education by working various jobs. He also reported on sports happenings for his schools for the area newspapers in New Jersey and also in Philadelphia. Right. So he got a very early start in journalism that he continued for the rest of his life.
Would you say that he was very driven? He comes across to me, and we're going to give some examples later on, but he comes across to me as someone who knows what he wants to do. He's focused and he's driven, which obviously gives him an advantage at such a young age where he can kind of hone his skills that he knows he's going to need for a chosen career.
In looking at his early writings and the letters that he sent to potential employers when he wanted to become a reporter, he is very driven. He sees a path for himself early on that he's always looking at the next step on the ladder. Right. He's someone who tries to, get on with his career and really works hard to ingratiate himself with his employers and also any potential allies he can find in the journalism field. And he
does have some. He does.
Yeah, he does.
Some.
And he's always looking for that next run on the ladder. Working as the correspondent for Harvard University, where he goes to Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and becomes a correspondent for the Boston's 3 newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst.
Wow.
And he needs that extra money, although he gets a lot of scholarships for his schooling at Harvard. Sure. He needs that extra income to get through, and has some interesting adventures at Harvard. One story I like to tell is that, he, of course, loved to swim, and so he tried out for the Harvard swim team, but he wasn't that great a swimmer, and Harvard had a very good swim team when he was a student there.
Right.
And so he had to have a swim off with another student for the last backstroke spot on the squad. And the person he swam against was a future president, John F. Kennedy. And Tregaskis beat Kennedy out for that last spot, although he said it was it wasn't that great an achievement, as he was not that great a swimmer, and the other swimmers on the team were much better than he was.
Right. Now, let me ask you real quick a couple of reactions to everything you just said. I don't know much about competitive swimming, but I can't help but imagine if I was well over 6 feet tall, I could just lean into the pool and be halfway to the other side. I'm just trying to picture this. He was very skinny, or whatever the proper term is, but he was very tall. But I guess
lean and tall.
Lean and tall.
Yes,
there
from
an
early age. He writes in the memoir he wrote about his life that as a schoolboy he was always bigger than the other boys of his age, and he resented bullies who picked on smaller boys, and always had battled them on the schoolyard.
Good for him.
And he was 6'5" plus.
Right.
One of the interesting aspects about doing my research was trying to track down just how tall he was, because there are all kinds of accounts of his height in various publications, from 6'6" to 6'7" to 6'9" even, and I had to go and look at his War Department accreditation. He was listed as 6 feet 5 inches tall, so that's what I went with.
Right. That's good. Yeah. At the end of this, I don't want to disturb the flow, but at the end of this, I have a very funny story about another famous person where people couldn't agree on his height, but we'll get to that later. But before we go on, because you are how should I put this gently, of a certain age. You probably, like me, can remember your mother or grandmother having the sewing machine in the house. When I read that part about the Singer sewing machine, I remember my grandmother. It was the pride of her collection of everything. She had her sewing machine, and it was built into a desk. Took it very seriously, and I just remember that. But there was a time when, I guess almost every household in America needed or wanted a sewing machine in their
Indeed.
house. Yeah.
My family didn't have one, but my wife's family, her grandmother, who I got to know in their basement, had that Singer sewing machine and worked on it religiously.
Right. Oh, No, it was a part of their life, and it saved, repairing clothes. You saved a lot of money, so very frugal, prudent thing to do. So good for them. Oh, and I don't know if this is so much a question or whatever, but I did want to get your reaction. A friend and I do a show on Leonardo da Vinci. And what it is Leonardo wanted to know everything there was about that could possibly be known about the world, so when he painted, it could be the most accurate paintings he could ever do. And Richard reminds me of that, because even, I think it's like in high school, certainly before college, he knows that he needs to know a lot of things about a lot of things throughout the world so he can be the best writer that he can be. He took it seriously.
Very seriously. He later said that, nonfiction writers should know something about almost every subject because, his or her article assignments might carry them into many highly specialized fields. And without a basic knowledge, they're going to be sorely handicapped in their research. Yeah. And he bragged that at one time, his personal library numbered it in thousands of volumes. And he said that estimated, that 60% of his books were reference material. So it's something he took seriously and tried to prepare himself for whatever subject he was writing about.
Sounds like he could have used an iPhone, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's jump into this. So his dreams, all his work, all the college and the writing. Oh, and I wanted to say this real quick. Was it in high school or college when he was writing articles under different names? Was it just trying to earn more money?
That was in high school, yes. He was trying to, earn more money to get more articles that he could be paid for. So he came up with, pseudonyms to use to distribute his pieces to various newspapers. Very smart.
Right. Smart. Let's go with the word ambitious and not illegal. Let's just say he was so keen, he wanted to get his stuff out there.
He was an enterprising young man.
Good for him. Entrepreneur. Okay. Yeah. So his dream finally comes true. It's 1941. He gets a job with the International News Service. Could you tell us about how he was able to score that?
Well, right out of college, he was hired by the newspapers that he had been writing for while he was a student there, and went to work at the Boston Advertiser and became a key contributor to its Sunday feature magazine, writing a number of various articles, hit about every beat he could. But as I said, he's always looking to what's the next step. With war clouds on the horizons, he really felt a need to be at a place where he might go overseas potentially. So he gets a job in 1941 with the International News Service. And this is a news agency owned by William Randolph Hearst. It's kind of the third child among the news services. You have the Associated Press, which is really the top-notch news service in the United States. You had United Press, which was second. And in third place, trying hard with inadequate staff, was the International News Service. And while the other news agencies could throw a multitude of reporters at a story, INS was really handicapped in what it could do. And one man often had to cover a wide area for the INS. And Richard Tregaskis found that out during World War II. Yeah. But he's looking ahead and wondering what's going to happen with the war. And he decides to take a burlesque course in learning Portuguese because he expects that Nazi Germany might well invade and take over England.
Right.
And their next step might be Brazil, where there's a big German population.
Mm-hmm.
So he's thinking, well, I'll learn Portuguese and know this, and the INS will send me, to Brazil to cover what's going on because the U.S. is not yet in the war.
Right.
But of course, Pearl Harbor happens. All that changes. His boss, Mr. Ferris at the INS, decides to give him an opportunity to be a war correspondent, and gives him a choice, either England or Australia, and he picks Australia and ends up in Hawaii, covering the Pacific Fleet. He's not sent on to Australia, but stops in Hawaii and goes off on many early adventures in those terrible first few months in the war in the Pacific, when it seems that America can do nothing right and Japan can do nothing wrong.
Exactly. And like you were saying, he was, I guess, bound for Australia. But then I guess he and others start hearing, hey, you might want to hang out for a little bit. There might be something coming up soon that you would be interested in. And of course, you can't really tell him anything more than that. So it turns out that Richard's going to, in some ways, start his career with this agency, covering one of the, if not the biggest story of 1942, the Doolittle Raid, America's attempt to get some type of revenge against the Japanese Empire.
I should also backtrack here and say that he's doing all this, going overseas, shortly after learning, after he joins the INS, that he's suffering from a debilitating condition. Yeah. That he finds out that, like his father and his grandfather before him, he has diabetes. And so he keeps that a secret from his employer because he doesn't want to let them know this, and so they might not send him on that overseas assignment that he desires. So he has to deal with diabetes while also covering combat, which I find just amazing. Yes. Insulin had been developed, but he was not on an insulin regime. He tried to control his condition through diet. Almost a starvation diet. He had an old-fashioned kind of doctor who advocated for this, and it really wasn't until after the war that Tregaskis started taking insulin shots on a regular basis. So imagine going into combat in the jungles of the Pacific on Guadalcanal to Sicily in Italy and also in Northern Europe. And later on in World War II, and you have to deal with a potentially, deadly disease that might hit you at any moment.
Right. And if I remember correctly, on board he had a bag, or whatever the proper term is, a container. Was it full of tins of
sardines? He had 100 tins of sardines.
Oh my God.
There were other correspondents there. Bob Casey, who was an early war correspondent in the Pacific and wrote a book about his experiences, including the mission for the Doolittle Raiders, was just really perplexed by this. Said, the food's pretty good on these Navy ships. I don't think you need the sardines. Well, he's trying to keep secret from the rest of his correspondents that he has diabetes.
Oh my goodness.
And he even had an early handbook from one of the leading figures in doing research on insulin. I think it was a Dr. Joslin. And he had faked a personal inscription from the doctor saying, so that he could say, oh, he's just a personal friend. He gave me this book, and that's why I have it with him.
Yeah. I'm trying to picture looking someone in the eye and going, oh, this book about diabetes, I'm really good friends with the doctor, and this book means a lot to me. Yeah, kind of stretching it a little bit.
Stretching a bit, yeah.
But the point is, because of his sacrifice, because I don't want to eat sardines, practically that and nothing else for days on end, but he is able to be there for the Doolittle Raid.
That's right. He's on the task force with the Doolittle Raiders. He's on the cruiser, the USS Northampton. He's sent on this mission. They don't tell him ahead of time what's going on. He learns about what is happening during the voyage. For the mission, looks on and sees these Army B-25 bombers on the deck of the Hornet, and has a front row seat to watch the bombers take off in very rough seas when they're spotted early by some Japanese picket boats. And Doolittle and his squad of Army bomber pilots take off very precariously from the shore deck of the Hornet and go off to bomb Tokyo. And imagine yourself as a young reporter. He's, just about 26 at the time, I believe. This is your first mission overseas. Yes. You see this very dramatic event. You get all this great detail from the sailors and crew on the Northampton, and you go back to Honolulu, and you can't write your story.
Right.
Because, of course, the military kept this, all the details about this mission secret for well over a year, I think it was. And it wasn't until a year later, much after he already received fame as the author of the best-selling Guadalcanal Diary, that his dispatches about the Doolittle raid are finally published in newspapers across the country.
Wow. I guess he's learning one of the many aspects of what it means to be attached to the military. My father was in the Air Force, and that is hurry up and wait. Yeah, you can write your article, but it's going to sit. Yeah, you're right. I think it sat there for at least a year before it became, for obvious reasons or whatever. But you're right, though. So he writes that. He sees some amazing things. And he is a kid. He's still learning. He's learning how the military works. But as big as the Doolittle raid was, he is then, and tell me, and hopefully I'm not getting this wrong, but as soon after that, he is sent to Guadalcanal, where the United States is going to try to check the Japanese from further expanding in that area. And it's going to be a different world.
There's something in between, even bigger. Yeah. He's there for the Doolittle raid, watches the bombers take off from the Hornet, and then right before the Battle of Midway, he's on the Hornet. So he's there talking to the crewmen, the pilots involved in that great battle. Gets to know very well John Waldron, who's the commander of the ill-fated Torpedo Squadron 8, which takes off from the Hornet. And all of his squadron are killed except for one man, Ensign George Gay, who survives. He's the only member of that squadron, and so Tregaskis gets an early taste of what combat means, and he gets to know these people, and had even joked them about maybe going on a flight with them when they returned after their first mission against the Japanese. But they don't return, and he has to deal with that and look at the empty, chairs at the table that he, is eating in the mess with these men, and they don't come back.
Right. And that sense of loss is not going to stop anytime soon, because when he does go to Guadalcanal, there is obviously he's going to get to know a lot of people, and there's going to be a lot of people lost during that campaign. And he's in there, he's writing about it. But what I really appreciated was he feels like it's his duty to tell the people back home what the soldiers are going through, the sacrifices they're making, the trials and tribulations, but to be honest with the American people and go, this is what I see.
That's right. He's always want to have firsthand accounts. He wants to report back to people in the United States what he saw personally. He wants to have that veracity in his news reports. And Tregaskis always had very good luck. He hears, offhand about this, major operation that's upcoming, wheedles his way on one of the transport ships for the invasion, is there with the Marines, and when they land on August 7th, 1942, is one of only two civilian reporters to be there for those initial weeks on Guadalcanal. He's there with another reporter, Bob Miller of the United Press, and he's there for the invasion, which doesn't meet a lot of resistance. But then there's that great naval battle after the first few days on Guadalcanal, and the Marines are kind of stranded without much support. And he had a choice to make. He's on the beach there watching the last transport ships load up to sail away, and General Vandergraaf says to him, it might be tough. We might be overrun. You never know. But he decides to stay with the Marines and spends the next 7 weeks during those very tough early days getting a foothold on Guadalcanal with the Marines.
Right. I'm sure what he saw was, just absolute hell in reporting it. And was it at this point during this campaign? It might not have been the only, but was it during this point that he actually had a sidearm, a pistol on his hip?
Yeah, one of the things he later admits that he couldn't write in Guadalcanal diary. Of course, war correspondents, if you're a civilian correspondent, you're under certain rules and regulations. Mm-hmm. You're treated with an officer status as a fully accredited correspondent with the War Department. And you're also supposed to be unarmed. You're not supposed to carry weapons. Mm-hmm. But the rules were a little loose, I think, in the Pacific just because of the just horrific conditions as far as combat between the Japanese, no holds barred, fighting back and forth. And so he and Bob Miller both packed 45s because he, as Tregaskis later said, that Japanese sniper doesn't know I'm a civilian correspondent with the military. He thinks I'm just another American who he needs to take a pot shot at. So,
yeah. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, that's right. Go ahead.
But even by this early stage, I think it's August or September. I'm trying to remember exactly. In 42, the Americans already well know that the Japanese have few rules when it comes to combat and how to treat a prisoner. So obviously that was a very prudent move on his part. And I just I know this is a very tense moment in the war, and it's certainly a tense moment for these guys. But just one little light moment. I lost count of the number of times, some in various forms and fashions, someone said, hey, if you get caught by the Japanese, they're going to use you as an observation post because you're so freaking tall. I just thought that was hilarious in a moment of intensity.
Yes, he was warned time and time again about that, but he stuck to his job. There's one of my favorite aspects of his time on Guadalcanal was, of course, they underwent a lot of shelling from Japanese ships offshore, and this is happening one evening, or it might even been, I think, during the Battle of Edson's Ridge, when the fighting was at its height, and General Vandergraft hears someone on a typewriter typing away at night. Said, what's going on? And
you can't see.
You can't see. And Tregaskis shouts out, "It's okay, General. It's just me, and don't worry, I'm using the touch system." So he, even under the most dire of circumstances, he felt the obligation to get his information down for his next dispatch.
So like you said, the last transport is leaving. He could have jumped on. He is a reporter. No one's expecting him to stay. But I think it's his own sense of duty that made him stay on the island with the men.
That's a real good aspect of his character. He felt a duty to the men doing the actual fighting. He felt a heavy sense of responsibility to get his story right. He was very upset early on that he, was turned down for military service. He was, of course, too tall, nearsighted, and felt very, very upset about this early on. And as he's commuting from Elizabeth, New Jersey to his job with the INS in New York before he's sent overseas, he even contemplates suicide because he's not doing enough for the country in this great battle against the Japanese in Nazi Germany, but is able to do his part by reporting on what the men doing the fighting, what they were experiencing in combat.
Yeah, that reminds me of, Tom Brokaw, The Greatest Nation, just that sense of duty, honor, responsibility. Not to get into it, but we could use a lot more of that today. But no, he literally is like, these men are fighting and dying. At the very least, I can tell their story. Yes, my life will be in danger, but it's got to be done.
Yeah, that's what he could do, and that's what he tried to do during the war.
So explain or tell us about the Guadalcanal Diary. It goes on to be a big hit. It goes on, they make a movie of it, but I imagine just everything that he's seen day to day, he's writing it down, and at some point, I guess it's time to put it all together. Didn't he have a certain theory about reporting information or getting information to people in a book sometimes is better versus a magazine or a news article or something like that.
That's right, because you're not maybe under some of the strictures of censorship as you would be in doing daily reporting. But he was very meticulous when he was on Guadalcanal. He always seemed to have the idea that, this would make a great book if I lived through it. Yes. And he had plenty of close calls, particularly in going with the First Raider outfit with Red Mike Edson on a number of missions. Mm-hmm. But during his time on Guadalcanal, he put this information in these small notebooks, and later on at night would transfer to a big black diary that he kept all his information in. And he had that diary in his notebooks as he took off at the end of September to leave Guadalcanal to return to Honolulu. And while he's in New Caledonia waiting for transport back to Hawaii, he's able to start work on his book. There's some fits and starts because he's still suffering some PTSD from his experiences on Guadalcanal. So every noise he hears, every loud noise, he's thinking it might be a shelling. You never know. Right. Even though he's safe behind the lines.
Doesn't matter.
Then he's on a bomber back to Honolulu. He works on it some more there and is able to finish his manuscript while he's back at Fleet Headquarters in Honolulu, and he's under strict censorship at the time. He would have to go to Fleet Headquarters every day. They would keep his notebooks at night because they had a lot of information, not only about his time on Guadalcanal, but also about the Doolittle mission and the Midway operation. So they're very afraid that spies might get a hold of this. And so while he's working on his manuscript, the censor's going through it, blacking out stuff that he can't say, including some weird stuff. But censors were under some tight restrictions. You could always, you wouldn't be punished for being too strict, but you could always be punished as a censorship officer if you let out the wrong information. So they were very strict as far as going through details that a reporter was trying to send back home. And so Tregaskis tries to mention in his book that Japanese camps had this kind of sweet odor about them, and that was blacked out. And he wondered why that was. If you think the Japanese would start using a different brand of deodorant to disguise their camps, he didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, but no, you're right. I mean, this is war. Better safe than sorry. So you can certainly forgive the people who are doing the censors if they don't want to get in trouble. So that makes sense. Now, this next part is not going to wow anybody, but it should. There's two things that I learned. One, and feel free to run with this in any way you want, but when his manuscript gets back, I think this was the first manuscript where they kind of put it out there for anybody. Hey, who wants to be the highest bidder on this? As far as I know, that was the first time. And two, the amount of time before someone snatched it up and said, yes, I want this. Again, that doesn't sound very exciting in today's world, but back then it was a very big deal, and he's still a 20-something-year-old kid.
That's right. He finishes the manuscript, sends it to his employers at the INS, and they have a outfit called Kingfisher Syndicate that takes the manuscript and sends it to 9 publishers to bid on the right to publish it. Well, they sent it to these publishers, and Bennett Cerf, who was one of the co-founders of Random House, had always had the idea that the first firm that could get a book out about Guadalcanal, it would be an immediate hit because it had captured the attention of the American public. So he gets this manuscript, I think it's on November 11th, if I remember right, takes it home with him, stays up all night, reads it, and the next morning calls Tregaskis' employer saying, I've got to have this book. And gets it, and he said, I'd gotten it and got it the rights to it before any of the other publishers had even read it. So they get the manuscript in November, and it's out and published as a book on January 18th, 1943, which if you're involved in publishing at all is just an amazing
right.
achievement. And it's an immediate success. It's the first book to sell 100,000 copies for Random House.
Wow.
It's on the best-selling charts. And while all this, it's later made into a movie, Guadalcanal Diary, the same name as the book.
Right.
But while all this is going on, Tregaskis is going back to Guadalcanal. To do some further reporting, flies on a number of B-17 bombing missions against Japanese bases in the Solomons, and his book's a hit, and he becomes famous, and he's not even there to get all the accolades
right.
that you would as a best-selling author.
He's in the jungle. He's back the jungle. Oh, so sum up so far. He was at the Doolittle raid, Midway. Now he's at Guadalcanal. He's got this best-selling book. He's going back to Guadalcanal. Is there anything else that he does before he has a very fateful day in November of 1943? I don't want to skip over anything if you think it's worth covering.
Well, he does go on another operation in February 1943 with the Army this time, with the 43rd Infantry Division. This is invasion of the Russell Islands, which are about 25 miles away from Guadalcanal. Right. It's unopposed, so there's not a lot of action, but he has, he reports on what's happening, and that's the interesting aspects of his time as a reporter. Often, he writes all these various dispatches, and sometimes they disappear. They're never published in some of his, and this happens to him later on in the war as well. But in April 1943, he finally returns to the United States. He gets the George Holmes Memorial Award given for the best example of an INS News Service reporter's work.
Right.
And he's suffering, of course, from malaria, which is a disease endemic to the Pacific, while he returns home. But he delays treatment until he's transferred from the United States to report on what was going on in Europe. And he goes to England, and there he finally recovers from his malaria. Right. Is there for the invasion of Sicily, has some great adventures, particularly with the British Army. Right. He's there with this commando, Jack Churchill, for the final race to Messina, the British Army's trying to beat Patton to Messina, and he's in this special outfit, and he detaches himself with this commando, Churchill and the driver, and this Jeep, and they race toward Messina on this harrowing adventure, but they're beaten by Patton's troops into Messina. And he's there for the invasion of Italy, is there for the capture of Naples. And through all his activity in the war, he had great luck. There are times when he's on a mission with the Marine raiders on Guadalcanal. They return on these small boats. They dock and they'd leave the boats. They were supposed to stay overnight, but instead, no, they were going to disembark. And that night, the Japanese come in and sink the boat. So he escapes by a hairbreadth. Right. And he has all these near misses earlier on in Guadalcanal. He goes from Guadalcanal on a small ship, a landing craft, to go across the way to Luga, I think it's called, to report on the fighting there. And a Japanese submarine pops up and starts chasing them, and they have a hairbreadth escape from being sunken by a Japanese. But in Italy, his luck finally runs out. And he's reporting on some fighting going on between Derby's Rangers and Const on a hill called Mount Porno, fighting almost hand-to-hand with their German opponents. And he's going up there with a couple of other military officers, and they go on ahead. And he's coming back down from the mountain, and the German shell strikes near him, and he's wounded. And, I love Guadalcanal Diary, but I think probably my favorite book by Tregaskis is Invasion Diary. Really? And I think I like it more because he writes so well about, the effects of being wounded. And I'll just read what happens when the shell hits. He writes this in Invasion Diary. A curtain of red fire rose, hesitated, hovered for an infinite second. In that measureless interval, an orange mist came up quickly over my horizon like a tropical sunrise and set again, leaving me in the dark. Then the curtain descended gently. There was no pain. Everything seemed finished, quiet, as if time had stopped. I sat up and looked down at the path, and he sees figures of men running to him.
Right.
And, he lost the power of speech, couldn't utter words, couldn't think.
Oh.
But it was clear to me what he wanted to say, but he couldn't say it. So,
right.
He gets these shell splinters embedded in his brain. But luckily, he's able to stagger down the trail to find his companions and to get sent on to an evacuation hospital for treatment. And lucky for him, the doctor he got at that evacuation hospital, Dr. William Pitts, was a whiz at head surgery.
Oh.
So he was very lucky. And although, he couldn't, use his arm for a time, his speech was almost unintelligible.
Right.
He worked his way back and was able to recover.
That's amazing. Yeah. Sorry.
Of course, I love it when two of my subjects get together, and Tregaskis is at this tent hospital, and he's visited by a number of his colleagues, including Ernie Pyle, who comes by and writes a column about his what happened to him and his recovery.
Right.
And even Ernie at that time, who's been through a lot himself, says, if I'd gone through what he had, I would have gone home and rested on my laurels forever.
Absolutely. Well, he's got a hole in his head.
He's got a hole in his head. That later, when he's sent back home at Walter Reed, the doctors have to insert a metal plate in his skull made of tantalum.
Right.
He kept his sense of humor. Before the operation, he asked one of his friends to take a look at my head and see if my brain's still there. I might want to use it later on. And then he joked with his doctor, asking, well, is this metal-proof? Is this metal bulletproof?
Right.
They say, well, unfortunately not.
Could you put that all over? That would be great. So he's went through this horrible thing. And you're right. He could, with everything that he's achieved so far, I guess it might be more accurate to say that for everything that he's reported on so far, he's got this book, he's got this horrible wound. Yeah, he could easily write it out, and I don't think anybody would give him a hard time. But he is recovering, but the war is still going on. And the way he sees it, if there's still a story to tell, I have to help tell it. And he has this very good quote where he tries to explain it to another person. This is what I got to do.
Yeah. And he goes back into the action.
Oh.
He's there for the breakout of Normandy, from the Normandy beachhead.
Right.
Attaches himself finally with the 1st Infantry Division, and for this ghastly attack on Aachen, Germany. And he experiences what can be the hell of street fighting, the house-to-house fight, street-to-street fight to capture this German city.
Right.
And it's just horrific. And he, of course, is still feeling the effects from his wounding himself, and his nerves, as he admitted, were shaky. And it's really gets to him. He calls it a blur of terror, a living nightmare. Running down streets and sees soldiers' faces full as dirt as shells screamed in. You hit the rubble, which was the earth, the shock of the cracking bullets that were coming too close. As he says, close ones don't whine as they do on TV. If they're dangerous, they crack. The knowing in his mind that an unseen enemy rifleman or machine gunner is trying to kill you.
Right.
The breathless hunt for him among the ruins. The silence of him, usually with grenades or artillery, the horror in men's faces at the moment you know well when you've been hit, and the dreadful ignorance of whether or not you're going to die. And he comes across, this officer named Ozell, and he's able to kind of get his nerves calm through his conversations with this company commander with the 1st Infantry Division, and he's able to, finally get his nerves in order, and writes very movingly and very effectively about what that experience was for him in Aachen for the Saturday Evening Post. in an article called House to House and Room to Room.
Wow. So he's able to pull it together enough to actually report upon his own feelings, images, everything is because he is suffering himself, just like the soldiers do. But he's able to write about it, and he's able to convey what it's like to have that kind of stress. And you're right, he goes through France, he goes through Belgium, he goes to Holland and Germany. And so I guess the Aachen thing, even though he's seen a lot already, even there's always more that can shake you up as a human being when it comes to war.
And he's seen his own friends killed. In Aachen, he's there, and a fellow war correspondent named David Lardner, who is the son of Ring Lardner, the famous writer and humorist, comes up, and he warns him about the dangers ahead. But his Jeep driver kind of ignores his advice and goes off, and Jeep hits a mine, and David Lardner is killed, and that really weighed on him, saying, maybe I could have done more to warn him about the dangers ahead.
Right.
But out of all this came his kind of a need and kind of a fever to write about what he had experienced. And this time, instead of a nonfiction book, he turns to fiction. And he writes a book called Stronger Than Fear, which comes out of his experiences in Aachen, and uses that to try to celebrate the bravery of the infantry and the men he had experienced Aachen with.
Do you think it would be fair to say that it seems to me that he was also it was therapeutic for him to write, whether it's the news articles or the fiction book, to just get it out?
Quite a bit. I think that really, particularly when it came to Stronger Than Fear, that it was a purging for him of all that he had gone through in Aachen, and is able to get it out, and wrote it very quickly. And it's a very short book, but it's very effective if you want to, one of the most effective, I think, fictional works written during the war, and gives you a really accurate view and feeling of what the fighting might have been like.
Right. And like you alluded to earlier, he's still not done. He's going to go back to the Pacific and report on a B-29 crew. I mean, the drive in this guy is something to behold.
Yeah, there's a great story. The Saturday Evening Post, of course, is a major national magazine at this time. And he'd written that article for them about Aachen, and they were impressed by his writing. So they, ask him, can you go back to the Pacific and do this series of articles called The Road to Tokyo? We want you to follow this B-29 crew flying from the United States to its eventual base on Guam for missions, bombing missions against Japan. And one of the editors even asked him, do you want to go? And Tregaskis thinks about it for a time. I really don't want to go, but I think I should. So he does go. And follows this crew and flies on some bombing missions with them.
Yeah, that's incredible. So, and when I was reading your book and I got to this part of it, I could not help but compare to the way things are done today, today's standards, whatever you want to call it. But he really did have this strong belief that you don't have to hide bad news from the American public. They can handle it. They're mature. They know it's going to be dark before the dawn. They get all that. And so he was really a proponent of tell the people what's going on, warts and all, because they're adults too.
Yeah, he thought it was very sad that about the state of public information, that some of the editors thought that the public would only buy good news, that they can't take or be interested in news about a reverse. He'd heard editors of different publications say, in effect, the public isn't interested in bad news and they couldn't sell it. Right. He always felt that anyone who said that was laboring under the delusion that the American public has a child mind. Right. And furthermore, the mind of a spoiled child, which he did not believe.
Sure.
He called it probably as false and low-grade a conclusion as the presumption that Americans cannot and will not learn how to read the war news intelligently. Right. And that's something he always tried to do, too, is to let people know how they could tell the accurate news they were getting from people overseas, from the far-fetched or someone who... if you were a war correspondent during World War II and you took your job seriously, like Ernie Pyle did, and Robert Sherrod, and Tregaskis, and Hal Boyle, and many others, Ruth Cohen, one of the great female reporters of the war, you didn't want to be known as what they called a communique commando. That is someone who just stayed behind the lines and got, the canned handouts from, SHAF, Supreme Headquarters in Europe, and based all your articles on that.
Yeah.
You could always tell the reporters who took their job seriously because their the date lines could be with the First Army, and you could see that they go from division to regiment down onto the company and squad level. They would make sure that when they were talking to someone, they get their hometown, something that Ernie Pyle made famous, and Tregaskis also did in his work to show that we're at the front, we're as near the front as we can get.
Sure.
We're trying to get firsthand information and accurate as information as we can.
We could certainly use more Richard Gaskis today. So that would be very helpful. So the war comes to an end. Richard has written several books, and he will, dear listeners, go on to write more. Why? Because his life is only halfway over. He's going to cover events in China, in Korea, and Vietnam. But I was thinking we could leave those stories for the listeners who would want to check out the book. Besides the stuff that we've covered, it still gives them something to enjoy. But again, his what do you call it? His mentality, his worldview doesn't change through these other events. He still wants to cover them and get the information back to the American people.
That's right. And all he does, he really connects well, I think, with those who are doing the actual fighting. And it continues in Vietnam, where, you think he'd had enough of war with World War II, but no, he's there in Vietnam, flying on helicopter missions, sitting in the backseat of a T-28 fighter bomber, flying on combat missions once again.
Right.
They just can't seem to get enough of the action.
Okay, so we're gonna leave the rest for the listeners. But I did want to ask. I thought I'd read when I got to the part of your book about his height and about the controversy about his height. I thought I'd read that the Army's maximum height was like 6'5", and if
6'5", right?
6'5". So if he's 6'5.5" or more, they're going to say, "We're sorry, you're too big. We don't want you." I'm trying to
for military service. I think that at early on in the war, that was the height limit when he was working early on with the INS. It was 6'5". He was also nearsighted. As you see in all of the photographs you see in the book, he's wearing eyeglasses. So not only is he, dealing with diabetes, he has to deal, taking care of eyeglasses in combat, which is not easy when you're flopping into a bunker or a empty shell hole when you're under fire by the enemy.
And don't forget your sardines. You got to keep those.
You got to keep those with you.
But when I read the part about the reason I'm bringing that up, when I read the part about the height, I had this zany moment years ago that it reminded me of. Many years ago, when I was a young man, I worked at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and we ride the bus up to that big house. And there was an older guy on the bus, and there was a tour guide on the bus. So this older gentleman raises his hand and he goes, "How tall was Thomas Jefferson?" And this guy goes, 6'1.5". So we get up to the house and we see a different tour guide. And the same guy goes, "How tall was Thomas Jefferson?" And he did that throughout the entire trip. And we got like 4 different answers. It's like, and I think he was just doing it to entertain the rest of us who were with him, knowing that we would get 4 different answers. And so I think officially Jefferson was 6'2", but 6'1", 6'1.5". And it just reminded me of all these variations of guesses of how tall Richard was. I don't know. It just reminded me of that. But before I let you go, one, please feel free to add on anything else you would like to about Richard, because the man was amazing. He represents so much that is good about humanity and about this country, his drive, his professionalism. I just walked away going, I want to be a better person after reading about the story of Richard. But I wanted to let the listeners know that you have other books that they might be interested in checking out. That, like you said earlier, there's the Dispatches from the Pacific, the World War II reporting of Robert L. Sherrod, One Shot, the World War II photography of John A. Buscemi, if I'm saying that right.
That's right. He was a photographer for Yank magazine. Instead of a civilian correspondent, he was a military photographer for Yank magazine during the war. He's from Indiana and was killed in combat.
Right. And I want to let you know that I've already got the Robert book. I've got the Ernie Pyle book. I'm looking forward to that. And there was Fighter Pilot, the World War II career of Alex
Vrashu, as he told me when I was talking to him about his exploits in the Pacific.
Vrashu.
It's Vrashu like cashew.
See, I needed that. I need it. And of course, The Soldier's Friend, A Life of Ernie Pyle. So all those books I recommend. I've already got all of them. They're just sitting on my shelf. Oh, and this weekend I will be watching the movie Guadalcanal that based on Richard's book. So I'm looking forward to that.
Great. I want to leave the listeners with one of my favorite quotes about Tregaskis that he wrote. I think tells you more about what drew him to combat. He said this in Invasion Diary. The lure of the front is like an opiate. The hazards of battle stir the imagination and give transcendent meanings to things ordinarily taken for granted. So that gives you some idea of what drew him into all the work he did during the war and afterwards as well.
Right. I agree with that sentiment up until the moment the first shot is then I'm out and then I'm gone. But anyway, but Mr. Boomhower, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for this book. I enjoyed it so much and I'm looking forward to the other ones. And feel free, if you want some data, come on back to the show and we'll talk about one of these other books.
I'll be happy to do that. It's been a great conversation, Ray. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Progressive presents an ad from Mom.
What does it say here? Bundle your home and auto insurance with Progressive and get protection round the clock. You know what? I'm sorry. I think it should be around. What are you signaling? Me to stop talking? Oh, all right. I'll stop talking. No, just had to tell me. That's all you had
Get
to
round-the-clock protection when you bundle and save with Progressive. It's easier than getting your mom to make this radio ad. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discount not available in all states or situations.